She looked me in the eye, her face cold, and told me to get out of the house I built with my own hands, the house I paid for, the home I thought was mine until my last breath. And when I asked her where she expected me to go, she smirked and said, "Go to hell." Those were the words my own daughter threw at me like stones. I didn't argue, I didn't cry, I didn't even pack a single bag. I just smiled, because what she didn't know was that the lock she thought she had turned against me was still mine to open. And the very next morning, she would be the one begging at my door. Thank you so much for watching and for giving me a little of your time. It means more than you can imagine. And before I go on with this story, I would love for you to tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Because every time I sit down to share these truths, it comforts me to know there are people listening from near and far. People who understand that life can break us and yet still leave us standing. And I want you to stay with me. Because what happened after those cruel words were spoken was not the end of my story. It was only the beginning of something none of them saw coming. I want you to know who I am and where I came from. Because my story did not begin the night I was told to leave my own home. It began many years before, when I was a young woman with nothing but hope in my hands and a heart determined to build a safe place for the family I dreamed of raising. I worked beside my husband, and together we poured our sweat into every brick and every beam of that house. There was no luxury in our lives, but there was dignity. And every paycheck we stretched, every meal we cooked from scratch, every hour we sacrificed was worth it, because we were creating a place that was more than walls and a roof. It was a home filled with laughter, prayers, and the simple comfort of knowing we belonged somewhere. When he passed, the weight of that house rested on my shoulders alone. And though many nights I cried myself to sleep from exhaustion, I never let it go, because that house was the last piece of him I could hold. The last reminder of all that we built together. My daughter grew up under that roof. She was fed by the meals I made. She was warmed by the blankets I stitched with my own hands. And every school book she opened was paid for by the sacrifices I made in silence. Even when I went without new shoes, even when I worked extra hours with tired bones, I did it because I wanted her to have more than I ever had. For many years, I believed she understood the love that raised her. She would smile at me and say thank you, and in those moments, I thought my efforts were not in vain. But as the years went by and as she became older, I began to notice small changes. A distance in her eyes, a sharpness in her tone. And at first I told myself it was just the weight of growing up, that maybe she would soften again with time. When she got married, I tried to welcome her husband with open arms. I cooked for him. I cleaned after him. I gave him the respect that a mother gives to the man her daughter has chosen. But slowly, I started to see how his family wrapped themselves around her, whispering in her ear, filling her mind with ideas that had no place in a house built by someone else's sweat. They would come and stay for long stretches, not just visiting but taking, moving chairs as if they owned them, claiming corners of the home as if it had been theirs all along. And every time I bit my tongue, I told myself it was better to stay quiet than to cause a storm. But silence, as I later learned, is often mistaken for weakness. And what I gave out of patience, they took as permission. I cannot tell you the ache of sitting in your own kitchen and watching strangers dictate where your plates should go, where your pictures should hang, where you should sit at your own table. It is a pain that no words can soften. And yet I endured it, because I thought love and patience might be enough to keep my daughter by my side. What I did not know then was that those small cracks in the bond between us were only the beginning. And that one day those whispers would harden her heart against me in a way that I still struggle to understand. The day everything began to shift, in a way I could no longer ignore, came quietly, almost like any other day. And yet, it carried a heaviness that told me the ground beneath my feet was no longer steady. I woke up early, as I always did, made myself a simple cup of tea, and looked around the house that held so many memories. The curtains I had sewn with my own hands, the photographs of years gone by, the smell of polish from the old wooden floor. And I thought to myself how blessed I was to still have a place that kept the story of my life alive. But later that afternoon, as I stepped into the living room, I noticed the chairs had been pushed aside, my husband's old armchair gone, replaced with a gaudy piece of furniture I had never seen before. And when I asked what had happened, my daughter's in-laws laughed as if I was asking something foolish, telling me they thought it was better this way. Brighter, fresher, as though they had the right to decide how my home should look. I tried to swallow the anger burning in my chest. I tried to tell myself not to cause tension, but deep down I felt something tighten, because it was not only the chair they had taken away. It was the respect that had once lived within those walls. I remember standing there, holding the edge of the table with trembling hands, listening to my daughter side with them, saying things like, "It is only a chair, why are you so sensitive?" And my heart cracked, because I had seen that chair cradle her father's tired body after long days of work. I had seen him read his newspaper there, and it was not just furniture to me, it was memory, it was family, it was love. From that moment, the small signs began to multiply. The food I cooked, pushed aside for meals they brought in. My voice drowned out in conversations where I was treated like an outsider. And slowly the house that once echoed with my laughter now felt like a stage where I had no part to play. I would sit in the corner, watching them rearrange my shelves, replace my curtains, talk about where they would set up their rooms as though it was only natural. And my daughter, the one I had raised with all I had, looked at me with a sharpness in her eyes I did not recognize. That sharpness cut deeper than any word, because it told me she had chosen them over me. And while I wanted to believe she was being misled, the truth was clear. Her loyalty was no longer mine. It was in those moments, sitting in silence, that I realized the home I had fought for. The home that carried my husband's memory and my years of sacrifice was slowly being taken from me, not by strangers on the outside, but by the very people who sat at my table and smiled while they carved pieces of my life away. The day the mask finally dropped is one I will never forget, because it was not whispered or hidden behind polite excuses. It was spoken plainly, cruelly, without even a trace of shame. I had just come in from the garden, my hands still carrying the scent of earth, when I heard laughter echoing through the living room. Her husband's family were gathered, speaking as though the house was theirs already, making plans about which rooms they would take, where they would place their furniture, and how they would invite relatives to come and stay. My heart pounded as I stepped closer, but before I could ask anything, my daughter turned toward me, her eyes colder than I had ever seen them, and she said it straight. "This house belongs to our family now. My in-laws will live here, and you should go." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. I gripped the doorway to steady myself, the blood rushing in my ears louder than their voices, and with as much calm as I could gather I asked her softly, "Go where?" Her lips curled into a smile that was not the smile I once knew, and she answered with words that burned through me like fire, "Go to hell." The people around her laughed as if it was the cleverest thing they had ever heard, and in that instant I knew the daughter I had raised, the one I carried through sickness, the one I gave my strength and years to, was gone, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. I did not shout, I did not curse, I did not plead, because begging for kindness from those who have already thrown away their hearts is a waste of breath. I stood there in silence, feeling the weight of betrayal sink into my bones, and yet beneath that heaviness was something else, something steady, something even they could not take from me. They thought their words had stripped me bare, but they had forgotten that walls and roofs are not the true measure of ownership, that the papers signed, the sacrifices made, the sleepless nights endured to keep a roof overhead, all of that still lived with me, not with them. So instead of breaking, I let their laughter fade into the background, and I walked away. I did not pack a bag, I did not gather my belongings, I did not turn back to see if they watched me leave. I simply walked out the front door of the very house they thought they had claimed, carrying with me nothing but the quiet knowledge that their victory was built on air, and that soon they would learn just how quickly the ground beneath their feet could crumble. As I stepped out into the night air, the door closing softly behind me, I felt a silence settle over me that was heavier than any words they had thrown at me. Yet within that silence, there was a strange kind of strength. Because though my heart ached and my body trembled, I knew I had not left in defeat. I had left with dignity. The street was quiet, the lamps casting long shadows on the ground, and every step I took seemed to carry the weight of all the years I had spent in that house. Every birthday celebrated, every tear shed, every sacrifice made, and yet I walked on without looking back, because I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I remember pausing under the old oak tree by the gate, breathing in the cool night air, letting it fill my lungs and calm the storm inside me. And in that moment, I realized I was not walking away empty-handed. I was carrying with me something they could never touch. The deed, the papers, the proof of everything I had built, all still bore my name, not theirs. And though they thought their cruel words had cast me aside forever, what they did not know was that I had already decided my silence would be my weapon, and my patience would be the trap they would fall into. I pulled my coat tighter around me, my hands steady now, and with quiet resolve I reached for the phone in my pocket. My lawyer had been with me for years, a man who knew the history of that house and the sacrifices behind it, and I called him that very night, my voice calm but unshaken as I told him what had happened. He listened carefully, and when I finished, he said words that wrapped around me like a shield. "You do not have to worry. They may laugh tonight, but by sunrise, they will know exactly whose house it is." As I hung up the phone, I lifted my head to the sky, the stars hidden behind the darkness of clouds, and I let out a long breath, because though my daughter had tried to strip me of everything, she had overlooked one truth. The truth that while she held the keys in her hand, I still held the lock in mine, and soon enough the very walls they claimed would rise against them, not with shouting, not with anger, but with the undeniable power of truth and paper, signed long before they ever dreamed of taking what was not theirs. That night I lay down with my eyes wide open, not from fear, but from a steady fire inside me, and though the bed beneath me was not my own, I rested easier than the ones who thought they had won, because I knew their celebration would be short. I kept replaying the moment she told me to go to hell, and instead of tears falling, a strange calmness washed over me, because I had seen enough in my life to understand that cruelty often carries its own punishment, and I did not need to lift a hand for the house itself to remind them of where the true power rested. When the morning light crept through the window, I rose slowly, my body sore but my spirit unbroken, and I poured myself a cup of tea as if it were any ordinary day, because peace, even in betrayal, is a choice we make. By then the papers were already moving. My lawyer had filed everything before the sun had fully risen, and as I sipped from that cup, I imagined them waking in the house, laughing still, unaware that the silence outside their door carried a storm they could not escape. I smiled to myself, not because I enjoyed their downfall, but because I had chosen not to fight with anger. I had chosen instead to let truth speak louder than my voice. They believed I had walked away with nothing, yet in truth, I walked away with everything that mattered, because the law was on my side, the documents bore my name, and their arrogance had blinded them to the simplest fact: you cannot steal what was never yours to begin with. As the day stretched forward, I sat quietly, waiting, knowing it was only a matter of hours before the phone would start ringing. I could almost hear her voice already, no longer sharp and cruel, but shaken, panicked, searching for the same mother she had cast aside only the night before. And in that thought, there was a lesson carved deep into my heart, that sometimes the sweetest justice is not found in shouting or revenge, but in patience, silence, and the unshakable truth that paper and ink carry more weight than prideful words ever could. As the hours passed, I could picture them inside that house moving as though they had already conquered it. Her in-laws probably sitting in my living room speaking loudly about what changes they would make, which walls they might paint, which rooms would belong to whom, and my daughter walking among them with that false sense of pride, as though she had finally claimed something she had not built, not paid for, not earned. I could almost hear their laughter as they pushed aside what was left of my belongings, treating my life's work as though it were clutter. And yet instead of breaking me, that image only steadied me more. because I knew every smile they shared was building them higher on a ladder that would soon collapse beneath their own weight. There's a kind of blindness that comes with greed, a blindness that makes people forget the very ground they are standing on. And that is what I saw in them, even from a distance. They believed possession was ownership. They believed that because they had keys in their hands they had power. But I had lived long enough to know better. I had seen men with cars they could not afford, women with jewels borrowed but never bought, families moving into homes they could not keep. And I had learned this simple truth: nothing built on arrogance lasts. That night, when I walked away, they thought they had silenced me, but in truth I had simply chosen to let silence be my shield, and silence has a way of making noise when the time is right. So while they enjoyed their false victory, I sat calmly, almost peacefully, because I did not need to be there to watch the walls remind them of whose name was carved into the heart of that house. Their victory was made of sand, and I knew with each passing hour the tide was rising. By the time the sun dipped low again, the world they believed was theirs would already be shaking beneath their feet. And I did not need to rush. I did not need to fight. I only needed to wait. Because some lessons, especially the cruelest ones, write themselves in the silence of time. It was not long before the quiet morning hours turned restless, and just as I had imagined, the phone began to ring. At first it was once, then again, then a third time, each call coming closer together, as though urgency had taken hold of her voice. I did not answer. I let the sound echo through the room, because I knew desperation speaks louder in silence than it ever does in words. When the fourth call came, I pictured her pacing the floor, her hands shaking, her confidence melting away as she realized the celebration of the night before had no ground to stand on. By midday, the calls were no longer calm. They were frantic. I could almost hear her through the walls, hear her saying my name not with anger now, but with fear, asking how this could be possible, demanding answers she had once thought she would never need from me again. Her in-laws, who had strutted around the house with pride, were likely looking at her with suspicion now, asking why she had assured them something that was never hers to give. And there she was, caught between their disappointment and the truth she could no longer deny, the truth that the house belonged to me and to me alone. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, breathing steadily as the phone lit up again and again, and though part of me ached at the sound of her desperation, another part of me felt the calm justice of it all. She had told me to go to hell, yet here she was, calling endlessly, as though I was the only one who could save her from the storm she had brought upon herself. There is a lesson in that, a hard and bitter one, that arrogance always ends where humility begins, and she was tasting it now, not because I shouted, not because I fought, but because truth itself had come knocking at her door. So I let the calls ring on, each one louder than the last, each one a reminder that sometimes silence is the sharpest answer, and in that silence I found a peace I had not felt in years, because I no longer had to fight for what was mine. The house itself was fighting for me. By the time evening fell, the silence I had chosen was no longer just mine. It had become the loudest voice inside that house. I later learned that the papers had been delivered early in the morning, folded neatly, with the weight of law and truth behind them. And when they opened those envelopes and read the words, their laughter died in their throats. The same people who had strutted proudly across my floors now stood frozen, realizing the home they thought was theirs had never left my hands. Their faces, I was told, turned pale, their confidence vanished, and suddenly the walls that had welcomed them so easily now felt like they were pushing them out. The phone did not stop ringing that day, but I stayed firm, because I had nothing more to explain. They had mocked me, they had told me to go to hell, and yet it was their pride that had led them into the fire. My daughter's voice, once filled with authority, was now cracked with panic, her words spilling too quickly, begging for me to talk, to make it right, to undo what she had so carelessly set in motion. Her in-laws, who once called me old and weak behind closed doors, were now urging her to fix it, their disappointment heavy on her shoulders. I could imagine the scene clearly, her trying to defend herself, stumbling over excuses, blaming me when all along the truth was written on the very papers they now held in their hands. There was a strange justice in it all, a justice that required no shouting, no confrontation, just the quiet unveiling of what had been true from the beginning. The house did not belong to them. The memories were not theirs to claim, and no matter how many times they moved the furniture or spoke as though I was invisible, they could not erase the years carved into every corner, the bills paid in my name, the sacrifices made by my hands. Their arrogance had been a mask, and now it slipped, revealing nothing but fear. As I sat in my chair, away from the noise, I thought about how easy it is for people to forget where they came from, to believe they can take what is not theirs simply because they desire it. And yet life has a way of humbling even the proudest voices, of turning keys into useless pieces of metal when the true ownership is never theirs to hold. That night, as the phone buzzed again and again, I allowed myself a small smile, because I knew the lesson had already been delivered, not by me, but by the very truth they had ignored. The days that followed were filled with calls that carried a different tone each time. Sometimes her voice was sharp with anger, as if blaming me for the mess she had created. Other times it was broken with tears, trembling as she asked me to please pick up, to please talk to her. And in those moments I sat still, because I had learned that not every cry deserves an answer, and not every wound is mine to heal. The in-laws who once spoke so boldly no longer had laughter in their mouths. They pressed her to find a way back into my good graces. But how could I open my arms to the same lips that told me to go to hell? How could I forget the sting of being pushed out of my own home, like a stranger? I thought about the years I had given, the sleepless nights, the food I went without, the clothes I mended until they were threadbare, all so she could stand tall in a world that would not have spared her otherwise. And yet when the time came, she chose pride and outsiders over the very hand that had carried her. It hurt in a place deeper than flesh, because betrayal from the one you raised is a pain that cuts through the soul, and there are no bandages for that kind of wound. And yet, even in my hurt, I could not deny that there was a strange balance in the way things had unfolded, because what they tried to take had turned back against them, not by my doing, but by the truth itself. Each ring of the phone was like a bell tolling a reminder that words once spoken cannot be taken back, that cruelty once unleashed cannot be erased. And though I sat in silence, my silence spoke volumes. It told her that I was no longer someone she could dismiss. It told her that the woman she thought was weak had never been weak at all. It told her that dignity, once awakened, cannot be silenced again. And I think she knew it too, because the more I did not answer, the more desperate her calls became, as if she was slowly realizing that she had not only lost the house she tried to claim, but also the trust and warmth of the mother she once had. So I stayed quiet, not out of hatred, but out of a deeper understanding that sometimes the only way for a person to see their reflection is to be left alone with their mistakes. And as the phone buzzed again, late into the night, I closed my eyes and let the sound fade into the darkness, whispering only to myself that peace is not found in revenge, but in knowing that truth will always rise, no matter how heavy the lies laid upon it. In the quiet of those nights, when the calls slowed and the world around me grew still, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened, not just the cruelty of her words or the arrogance of those who thought they could take what was mine, but on the long road that had brought me there. I thought about how easy it is for people to forget the hands that fed them, how quickly love can be buried under greed. And yet I also thought about strength, the kind of strength that does not roar or fight with fists, but sits patiently, trusting that truth will speak louder than anger ever could. I realized that in walking out of that house without shouting, without breaking, I had done something powerful. I had shown them that dignity cannot be stolen, not by laughter, not by cruel words, not by keys waved in the air, because dignity is carried inside, and it shines brightest when everything else is stripped away. I sat by the window one evening, looking at the fading light, and for the first time in a long time I felt peace, not because the wound had vanished, but because I knew I had chosen the better road. They had filled the house with noise, but I had filled my silence with wisdom. And in that silence, I saw clearly that some lessons are not ours to teach with words. They are taught by the weight of consequences. My daughter had to face her own reflection in the eyes of those she tried to impress. And as much as it pained me to know she had turned against me, I understood that sometimes the deepest lessons are learned only when pride shatters, when false strength falls apart. I told myself over and over, I may have been cast out by the lips of my own blood, but I was never truly without a home. Because home is not only walls and bricks. Home is memory, sacrifice, love that was once pure. And even if they rearranged every room, they could not erase the years I had poured into it. That thought gave me comfort. It reminded me that no one can take away what has been carved into the soul. And in that quiet reflection, I knew that I would not let bitterness consume me. I would not let anger poison what years I still have. Instead, I chose to let the truth settle like a stone, unmovable, undeniable, and let it speak for itself. And as the phone buzzed again, softer now, almost pleading, I looked at it with calm eyes, whispering to myself that forgiveness and trust are not the same. And while I could forgive in my heart, I would not forget. Because forgetting would mean I learned nothing. And I have learned everything. In the end, I understood that life has a way of showing us who truly stands with us, and who only stands when there is something to take. And though it broke my heart to see my own daughter choose pride over love, I also found a strength in myself I did not know was still there. I learned that silence can be sharper than any word, that patience can carry more power than anger, and that truth has a way of finding its voice no matter how deeply it is buried. The house remained mine, not just on paper, but in spirit. And though they tried to strip me of it, they could never strip me of the dignity I carried in walking away with my head held high. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of my story. Your time means more to me than I can ever say. And if my words touched you, I would love for you to leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Share your own thoughts. And please do not forget to subscribe, so we can continue walking through these stories together. With truth, with strength, and with heart.